So, you know, it's always interesting teaching this class to one group in the daytime and then a different group in the nighttime. And I would say the daytime people, like you guys, we've been together, most of us, for a long time. The evening group is a lot more challenging. I want to tell you, I don't know why. Maybe it's like, if I'm going to come on at night, there better be worth my while. But the whole issue of, you know, of a lot of these texts, I don't think this was in the daytime class. I think this was in the evening class. It's like, these are all, you know, apologetic texts to try to get God off the hook for not, you know, doing what God should do. So, you know, maybe, you know, probably, to a certain extent, that's probably true. Like, the rabbis tried very hard to grapple with the issues that we grapple with, of why there's evil in the world, and why do we have stories in the Torah where God acts and we don't see a God acting in history, and good people are suffering, and where is God in all this? And, you know, I suppose on some level they could have had other choices, right? They could have converted to Christianity. They could have, you know, left Judaism in one way or another. But they were dedicated to the endeavor of the insistence, I'm sure to some skeptical audiences, that God was still important and that we were still in a relationship with God. And so we're going to look at a text today, well known to a small group of people, from the Torah, and then see how the rabbis deal with it. So this is a story in the book of Exodus. We'll be getting to it soon in the Parsha, where the children of Israel have left Egypt. They are in the desert. They've already received the 10 Commandments, and they are attacked by the Amalekites, or Amalek, who become really seen in the Jewish, in the rabbinic tradition, and in the Torah, I think, too, as sort of the epitome of evil, right? What kind of what kind of people would attack recently freed slaves? You know, it's not even really an army. It's just a group of, like, you know, refugees, right? It's a group of refugees from slavery. We're told that the way things line up in the Torah when they leave Egypt, that the women and the children and the weak are in the back, which, you know, and they attack from behind. So not only do they attack, you know, this very weak population, but they attack the weakest of the weak population. Nonetheless, we're going to see in this story, it's not our only encounter with Amalek, but we're going to see the Israelites fighting back. And again, you may be familiar with the story, or maybe not. So Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, pick some men for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. So we're at the mountain army, right? So Joshua, the military leader of the Israelites, go, you know, find some men that are able to fight, and, you know, take them out to fight. And Moses says, tomorrow I will stand myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses had told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Then, whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hand, remember, he's no spring chicken here. Moses' hand grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set, and Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. So what's going on here? Yeah, Marcia?
It's the ultimate example of God is on our side. And what's interesting is that it's not Moses. Moses is limited by his physical humanity and ability, but that doesn't matter. It's not because of what Moses is doing. It's but because of what God is doing. But if he has support, which he does, it's okay. His human frailties don't matter. Still a strange story.
It's a strange story because let's look back, because the assumption is that there's something, I mean, this story has a lot of issues. There's the assumption that something is miraculous is going on, perhaps, but it requires Moses' hands to be raised. The victory, like they are defeated if his hands fall. And so his hands are supported and it allows them to succeed.
But is it his hands raised, or the sword has the magic power?
Aha. So is it literally his hands, or is it the
rod?
And if it's the rod or the sword, well, at the bottom it says sword. If it's the rod, why can't somebody else hold it up?
Aha. Good question. Why can't we say, all right, Moses, you're getting tired. Pass this over to me and I'll hold it up. So
Right.
does it have to only be Moses? There's lots of other questions.
Well, God has a relationship with Moses, not anybody else.
Okay, God has a relationship with Moses, so presuming, let's look at these opening verses. Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, pick some men. Joshua did it, Moses said, whenever Moses held up his hand. Who is not mentioned?
Aaron.
Or God.
God,
God.
right? It doesn't say God says to Moses, when you hold up your hands. God isn't even mentioned here. So it's an interesting miracle. If it's a miracle, it's an interesting miracle where we don't see God saying, this is what you need to do. And if you do this, the Amalekites will be defeated. Marcia?
But wasn't this the same rod that he used with Pharaoh to produce all those miracles?
Perhaps.
Oh.
Elise, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, God will act, but only if he is asked to act. And the way that he is being requested to act is by Moses holding up his arms. And Moses somehow knows that that's the way to communicate. Even before you got to the text, I do this little Shabbat thing with my mother at the nursing home, and she put something in the itty bitty mini siddur that says, pray as if everything depended on God, act as if everything depended on you.
Ooh, nice.
And I see that in this story.
When Moses hears that the Amalekites are about to attack, what in an alternative, what might Moses have done?
Could have prayed.
Could have prayed, right?
Yoo-hoo,
Said,
God.
Yeah, God, help us out.
Right, God, help us out. The Amalekites are coming. Could you please take care of them? Like that would have been a different story, right? The different story. Here's the Amalekites are coming. The enemies are coming, and Moses prayed to God, come and take care of this enemy for us. They're on their way. And instead, Moses, who's got this direct relationship with God, doesn't even consult with God. Doesn't say, God, what do you think we should be doing at a moment like this? I mean, we have other examples of Moses praying to God or talking to God in the Torah, but Moses doesn't even ask God, right? Moses automatically goes into an enemy's coming. We better mount a defense, an off, whatever. We better get a little army together and go attack these people that are coming. There's a beautiful midrash. I'm careful about saying famous midrash. There's a beautiful midrash where that Hartman didn't share in this curriculum, but could have equally been shared in this curriculum, is the crossing of the Red Sea. There's a midrash that says that the Red Sea doesn't part until Nachshon steps into the sea. Right, the first person that believes that God said he's going to part the sea. It looks pretty deep to me. I'm going to start walking and the sea will part. And one of the midrashim says it was up to his neck before it finally parted. So that's a lot of, assuming that takes several steps, that's a lot of, I'm keeping going. I'm going, I'm still going. But that story is used very often as the example of, miracles may happen, but you better well, I can't remember exactly the quote you just said, Elise, about act as if, say that one more
Act as
time.
if, pray as if everything depended on God. Act as if everything depended on you.
So, I'm going to walk in, I'm going to mount a battle. And then, and we're going to look at a quote by David Hartman. And then the question is, how do we as sort of moderns read back into the story? Like, it's a miracle, it was a miracle. I often think when we think about stories in the Torah and what our ancestors claimed was a miracle, if you had been a slave in Egypt and you had been freed, that could have been whether it happened exactly the way it says that it happened in the Torah, you would have experienced that as a miracle, because slaves were not freed from slavery. So if it happened to you, it happened to your people, you would have to have said that it came from God, because how else could something like this have possibly happened in history? So the rabbis we'll look at it now, very, I think, an interesting interpretation of how to make sense of this story, right? Because they would only have loved to have a leader against the Romans. If they lifted their arms, their army would have been victorious, and, okay, we'll prop the arms up so that we can keep winning. And then the question, of course, which I don't think anybody said, but the question is really, well, if his arms are down, like, what does that mean? Right? What is that? What could that possibly mean? It seems rather arbitrary that this poor older guy who can't lift his arms, that the whole battle is determined about whether Moses's arms are up or down. So if you think of this as God performing this miracle is reliant on whether Moses's arms are up and down or down, then the story seems silly, right? Because then the story seems silly. Like, God needs magic, God needs a certain thing, and God doesn't get like, well, Moses' arms aren't really up, but if they're propped up, then I'll continue to do this victory, and if they fall down, then I'll let them out. Okay. If you look at it as a miracle like that, then God seems very arbitrary and very silly, and that's what the rabbis don't like that. So here's a Mishnah from Rosh Hashanah, from the tractate Rosh Hashanah. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed. Did the hands of Moses, so this source is 2,000 years old. Did the hands of Moses wage war or break Israel's ability to raise war? Like, that's to wage war, like does that make sense? Rather, this teaches that as long as Israel would look upward and subject their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed, and if not, they fell. Similarly, make for yourself a fiery serpent and mount it on a pole. This is to end a plague later on in Numbers. Anyone who was bitten and shall look at it, he shall live. Did the serpent kill, or did the serpent keep alive? Rather, when Israel would look upwards and subject their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed, and if not, their flesh would melt away. So what's this saying then? How do they sort of reinterpret the story? What are Moses's hands doing for the people? Yeah, Marcia?
Well, it's symbolizing the faith that if you can lift upwards, and it's okay if you grow weary or skeptical or whatever, if you have others to help you, it counts.
Right. So when Moses's arms are up, what does it cause the people to do? Besides win?
You have faith in God.
To have faith in God, right? They're directing their faith in God. And as long as they believe that their faith is, as long as they believe and as long as they're faithful, this will allow them to have this victory.
It gives them bravery.
It gives them bravery. It gives them faith, a feeling that God is on their side. If they look down, if Moses's arms fall, which could make them feel dejected, right? Like Moses's arms fall, or they're looking down, they no longer have faith in themselves. If you remember the story from the spies going into Israel, when Joshua leads the spies and going into Israel, and Joshua and Caleb come back with a good report, but the 10 other spies come back with a bad report. And one of the things that they said is the people were giants and we look like grasshoppers in their eyes and in our eyes too.
Mhm.
Right? So once you look down, once you lose faith, so Moses's arms aren't performing a miracle, according to the Mishnah. They're not performing a miracle per se, but they are a rallying point of which the Israelites rally around and have, I don't know, I don't like sports, but I've seen enough sports movies, right, where the coach in the locker room like gives them the pep talk about, whatever, so they could go in and win. Eileen?
Yeah, it seems like this one event is in a continuum where God is constantly trying to take these former slaves and engage them. They keep pulling back. And there has to be for them this physical manifestation of the arms up that they don't have it internalized yet.
And maybe they also need to like fight this fight themselves, right? Up until now, they've been told, and even then we know that it doesn't give them enough confidence to go in and conquer the land in 40 years and the next generation and all of that. But at a certain point, this decision, without consulting God, right? Without consulting God, Moses and Joshua feel like a battle has to be fought. We better go fight the battle. And it's really the first thing that the Israelites do that's not just passive, right? That God's going to free them. I mean, other than maybe putting the blood on the doorpost, like that's also an act of faith. But it's a bit of a different act of faith, putting blood on your doorpost and, going out and fighting an enemy army is quite a different act. And so this is really the beginning of the Israelites growing up, their independence, and it doesn't take, let's just say, I mean, I think about this a lot when we talk about Israel. And if, it probably would depend what day, I would be asked or you would be asked. But if I ask the question, is Israel's army the strongest army of all of its neighbors?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You might say it's the strongest army in the Middle East. I'm not sure about Iran. I'm not sure how Iran would weigh up with this, but we say Israel's army is the strongest army in the Middle East. We know that Israel has nuclear capacity, even though we're not supposed to talk about it. Do we have faith that Israel could not be defeated by Israel's enemies? Right, we don't, right? Like on any given day, the question of whether Israel is strong and secure and Israel is weak and vulnerable, we're not really sure, right? We're not really sure. Like two things can sort of be true at once, right? So God is fighting on the side of the Israelites. The Israelites have seen God's great power. The Israelites feel absolutely vulnerable and need this symbol of Moses standing up there with his arms. We know from the story of the golden calf, as soon as Moses disappears, the people panic. So Moses as a symbol is very important in the lives of the Israelites. Marcia?
I'm trying to remember when they are complaining, first of many, about why did you take us out of Egypt to die here? Is that before or after Amalek attacks?
Before, because they start
Okay.
complaining
Okay,
about-
so I mean, some of this I think could be a further confidence in Moses's leadership, because that was always kind of
right, like when Moses, right? I mean, they could challenge Moses all the time.
And they do.
challenge Moses all the time, but in this moment, they need to see him with his arms lifted. So it is possible, like in fairness to the text itself, it is very possible that the simple meaning of the text is this is miraculous, right? God is acting, and yeah, God actually needs Moses's arms up or down. So there is, in the simple meaning of the text, there could be this sense in the Torah that this is yet another one of God's miracles, just like the 10 plagues or the parting of the Red Sea. However, in this miracle, he needs the participation both of Moses as a leader and the fighters.
Mhm.
In that way, there's a similarity, but there's also a huge difference. And now we're going to look at my favorite chapter in the story of Esther. I have studied this with some of you before. I love this chapter. And since Purim is just a couple of weeks away, it's kind of appropriate. I didn't plan the curriculum this way, but it's appropriate to look at it leading into Purim. So this is Esther chapter 4. So just had to remind us of the story, right? King Ahasuerus, he has this huge banquet. Vashti doesn't want to appear in front of his drunken guests. She's sent away. The rabbis say she was killed. We don't know, but she's banished. She's gone. And Ahasuerus launches, the world's biggest beauty pageant for a bride. And Esther is chosen. And when we tell this story to our children, I don't know. I should probably ask the kids. I don't know what the kids really think, but I think we tell the story of like, yay, Esther won. And the only really yay Esther won is because she's then there to help in the time of need when beginning in chapter 4. But we see at the beginning of chapter 4, we don't really tell this to the kids, that, every single woman in the beauty pageant is taken into the king's harem. Nobody's sent home. And, the fact that Esther's the queen maybe puts her in, a little bit of a better position than anybody else in the harem, but not much, right? She has no autonomy. She can't leave the harem. She can't speak to the king unless she's called. It's not exactly the kind of life that we would want for any of our daughters. But nonetheless, Esther is in the right place at the right time to save the Jewish people. So Esther's in the harem. She doesn't hear what's going on, right? She has no idea what's going on in the outside world. Nobody's bringing her the newspaper. She's not speaking to anybody in the outside world. She's not even able to meet with her, we don't know, cousin, uncle, her relative Mordecai. She can't even meet with him in person. So Mordecai hears about Haman's decree to kill all the Jews, and he tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth and ashes and goes through the city crying out loudly and bitterly. So Mordecai begins to act out these mourning rituals, like tearing your clothes, putting on sackcloth and ashes, are all rituals of mourning and crying and weeping. So, I think in the vernacular, I would say it's as if he's sitting Shiva for himself and all the Jewish people. What doesn't he do when he hears the news that you might have thought a biblical figure would do?
That doesn't come in.
Pray, to pray.
You think he might start to pray, right? Like he hears this terrible thing is going to happen. It's almost as if he accepts as an inevitability,
Mhm.
right? He hears this decree and he starts to cry and go through these mourning rituals as if it's sort of a done deal. But the one thing in the Bible you might think that Mordecai would do is he begins to pray to God for, to be saved, for the Jewish people to be saved, and then, get some sort of a message about, why don't you try doing this? But Mordecai does not turn to God at all in the entire story. So that's, the rabbis noticed that is a, kind of strange, and it's really strange for a book of the Bible.
Right.
It's the only book of the Bible where God's not mentioned. So that's, by definition, that would get the rabbinic attention because that's very strange. It's also, we also have the book of Daniel, but it's really, most of the action in the rest of the Bible, not in the Torah, but in the Bible, takes place in Israel. And this is a story of a diaspora community. And it's probably, in many ways, besides it's a holiday that's fun and you get to celebrate and you get to be irreverent and all the things you're not allowed or supposed to be doing the rest of the year. But this story, the Joseph story, the Daniel story, the story of Jews being helpless outside of the land of Israel and reliant on a Jewish person having a relationship with the court, of being in the right place at the right time. I mean, that's how Jewish communities survived or didn't survive the entire time in the diaspora. So these stories are, I don't know, early overshadowing of what happens in the Jewish community, and probably they're so beloved because Jews are saved, and that's the hope, right? That these communities will be saved. Often when they're not saved, you know, one of the things that you've heard me say a million times is the rabbis love the story of the Exodus from Egypt because in it contains the promise that if God did it once, God could do it again. I'd like to suggest that the people love, and people, you know, we love the Haggadah, and it's not that we don't buy into that story and the fact that it could happen once, it could happen again, but I think that Jews love the Purim story because it's a story of human beings that act in such a way to save the Jewish people.
Right.
And that did happen again and again. And so the belief that if that happened once, it could happen again, because it happened again and again, is probably a story, like if you had to put your faith in the Exodus story versus the Purim story, you know, if you had to vote, not that I've ever asked anybody to do this, but if you had to vote, you'd probably vote for, like, you know, let's mount an army, like, let's, you know, send a letter to the king, let's, you know, what you'd probably vote for what human beings can do to try to save other human beings, because even though there are a gazillion dismal failures in that story, there are many, many more of them than God stepping in and bringing a group of slaves out of slavery. And so that's part of it, you know, what this unit is about is, you know, divine intervention or human action, which then the rabbis or other, you know, Jewish philosophers read back into, you know, these are miracles, they're just a different kind of miracle. So he comes in front of the palace gate because he can't go in the palace wearing sackcloth. So not only is there a dress code to go into the palace, because, you know, Ahasuerus is a party guy, he only likes to see happy things, but he only likes to see happy things, so you don't enter the palace in clothes of mourning. And in every province that the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, wailing, and everybody lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Mordechai's in sackcloth and ashes, and he's wailing. This adds one other thing that the Jews do that Mordechai didn't do, which is
Fasting.
fasting. So everybody, so let's just, you know, juxtapose this. Everybody in the entire kingdom knows what's going on except for Esther, right? The one Jew in the palace close to the seat of power, is the one person that has no idea what's going on here. But fasting is involved, and fasting is a type of prayer. So it is possible, like, you know, it's not praying with words, but we do fast to get God's attention. So it's possible that this is intimating, and in a more subtle way than saying, and then all the people started praying to God, and this is what they said. So we don't get that, but they start doing this action that is, at least in our tradition, is something to get God's attention. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. So all she's informed of is Mordechai's at the palace gate in sackcloth and ashes. Now, again, you might think that she would send a message, what's going on? Why are you in sackcloth and ashes? But she doesn't. She's agitated. She sends clothing for Mordechai to wear so that may he take off his sackcloth, but he refuses. So it's not the most effective communication. Esther doesn't know what to do. And I think part of this is important because you want to set up Esther as somebody who doesn't know what to do and doesn't know how to act. She's beautiful. I think I've told this before. I used to say to my children, the wise and beautiful Esther. Like, just 'cause I thought it was important that they, you know, not just see this as, you know, the great beauty pageant. But she doesn't really know what to do. And so you want to juxtapose her not knowing what to do so that when she steps up and she does know what to do, it's a major transformation in her personality. So thereupon Esther summoned Hathach, one of the eunuchs whom the king had anointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn the why and the wherefore of it all. So when he refuses the clothes, she's like, all right, now I need to know what's going on here. And Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace gate. Again, Esther can't say, bring him in and I'll have a cup of tea with him and find out what's happening, nor is she allowed to go to him. The best she can do is to send a messenger back and forth. So Mordecai tells Hathach all that happened to him and about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him the written text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan for their destruction, and bade him to show it to Esther and inform her, and to charge her to go to the king and to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. So again, he doesn't say to her, Esther, you better start praying. We're all praying. He's got, who are you going to plead? Not going to plead to God. Who are you going to plead to? Achashverosh, right? The only one that really has the power to do something. So Mordecai says to Esther, he tells her, this is what you need to do. So Hathach comes and delivers the message to Esther, and Esther told Hathach, you know, this is how the story like builds anticipation, right? By slowing everything down. Take back to Mordecai the following reply. All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know, but everybody knows. I may not know what's happening with my people, but everybody knows this, that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter to him may he live. Now I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. So, Esther, I mean, again, this wonderful, you know, contest that she wins, 30 days. He's not even interested in her anymore. She's like, you know, queen for a day, and now he's got the whole harem, and he's not too interested in her for 30 days. And she can't go to him. She risks her life going to the king without being called. So this is a pretty, you know, horrible situation. So this is what she sends back to Mordecai. And when Mordecai was told what Esther said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you attain to royal position for just such a crisis. So the first question is, what does it mean, do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape?
Does Haman know she's Jewish?
No.
No.
Haman doesn't know she's Jewish. The king doesn't know she's Jewish. So this could mean, I think, a couple of different things depending on how you interpret it. Don't think that you alone will escape. So there's kind of two choices here. One, her identity is revealed somehow, and she'll be killed along with everybody else. But what's another possibility? That her identity won't be revealed, but it's the end of the line for her and her her parents' house, her father's house, right? Like,
Yeah.
Maybe you'll be killed because you'll be found out. Maybe you'll be killed by coincidence because there's some divine, retribution going on here. Or maybe you're just, dead to your people.
That's the other thing. Yeah.
Right.
Dead, or she'll suffer such pangs of conscience,
Right.
have done nothing.
Right. Would you want to be the only Jew left?
Yeah.
Like you're in the palace and everybody else is like, what kind of life is that?
Mm.
Right? What kind of life would that even be? So I love this. And it's always translated as if you keep silent in this crisis. But the Hebrew is charesh tacharishi. This is Yodalid, ki'im charesh tacharishi. A cheresh is a person that's deaf, a deaf person. So it could be if you keep silent, but the literal translation is if you deafen yourself,
Oh,
which I love. This is why I love this. One of the reasons I love this chapter, right? If you deafen yourself in this crisis,
Are still
Right.
guilty.
right? You cause yourself, I don't want to hear. I
uh-huh.
don't want to hear it. I'm not going to hear it. There's nothing I can do.
But you're still guilty.
But you're still right. You're still, you know, like we wouldn't use the phrase if you deafen yourself. It's very Jewish, right? To hear the cries, Shema Yisrael. You know, most people didn't have written text, like they learned, through oral traditions. We would say, probably we would say if you look away, right? If you
Right.
blind yourself, if you look away. And it's, we're overwhelmed because we almost don't have a possibility of looking away because we're bombarded 24/7. So the question of like how we allow ourselves to feel the call to help people without being so overwhelmed. I mean, I read this piece, so I have not watched I did not watch the George Floyd video, and I'm not watching the Tyree Nichols video either. I believe the reports that I'm reading, and what happened was horrific and murder. But somebody wrote a piece that we must watch because we must bear witness. And, one could make a compelling argument for that, but I'm still not watching it because I feel like I think there are ways to bear witness without watching something that's so horrific.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think other people should make their own choice. I'm not saying anybody shouldn't watch it, but but how do you, I think about this and I use this example quite a bit. At least I don't know if you know that I've used this example, but we're helping one family from Afghanistan.
Mhm.
It would be overwhelming to think about all of everybody else that we're not helping, everybody else that we'll never be able to reach, everybody else in the Ukraine, everybody else in every crisis, everybody else. But all we can do, we can't help everybody else, but we can help this one family. And if this one family gets on their feet enough and is independent enough to not need our help, then we'll help another family. You can only do what you can do. There's a very famous Jewish phrase, like you are not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist. Right? That sort of, we're never going to solve the problem, these overwhelming problems, but neither are we free to walk away from them. So we're not allowed to deafen ourselves, to the cries of people that are suffering. So then Mordechai says to her, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter.
Is that God?
Well, the rabbis say that this refers to God, right? Maybe Mordechai thinks somebody will mount an army and defeat Haman. I don't know, right? But the rabbis say this is the one phrase in the book of Esther that refers to God, that shows that Mordechai has faith, that if Esther doesn't act, and there's nobody to act on behalf of the Jews, that God will step in. But it's a pretty vague reference.
And it would be the only example in the diaspora of a miracle.
Right.
Post-biblical.
Right. The idea that God will come and act in history. Right. Without human beings doing it. So this is Esther's great moment of a decision, right? Like, and he's saying to her, you may die going into Achashverosh, but the alternative is death. Whether he means that literally, whether he means that figuratively, like you got to go, Esther. And so up until now, and I love this, up until now, Esther's very passive, right? Mordecai tells her to enter this contest. She enters the contest. She talks to the eunuchs in the court and says, basically she takes their advice because it's actually smart because she knows they're going to know what Ahasuerus likes or doesn't like. But from this point on in the whole book of Esther, the action changes and it's Esther taking action and Esther telling what Mordecai to do and Esther coming up with a plan. And she, not only because she could have said to him, okay, I'll do this, but tell me what I should say and do.
Mhm, mhm.
Right. And she doesn't. She's like, okay, it's like she takes a deep breath, she realizes, and then she becomes a woman of action. Go, right? Lech, right? This is the command form in Hebrew, right? She's, Mordecai, if you wouldn't mind, go. Assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan, fast on my behalf. So again, fasting comes into it again. Do not eat or drink for 3 days. That's quite the fast. Night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I shall perish. Avadati, avadati. If I am to be lost, I will be lost, which is really, perish is a good translation, but there's something like if I'm lost, I'm lost, but I'm going to do this. So Mordecai went about the city and did just as Esther commanded him. So already, right, in the Bible, we have these stories of God, not, or at least this story of God not acting, human beings having to act for themselves. Human beings have to, we have the first story we saw of Amalek to a certain extent, that human beings need to act and take matters into their own hands. So, so Joseph Dov Soloveitchik was a great, very well-respected, well-known modern Orthodox rabbi who lived in the early, he probably passed away at the end of the 20th century. So he was like a contemporary of Rabbi Frankel's, right? So he, and he was really in many ways, the modern Orthodox rabbi, the most respected rabbi of his generation, for people that really wanted to kind of, be Orthodox, but have somewhat of a foot in the more modern world. So he says the hidden core of the concept, and God created the human being in his image, places the obligation on the person to personally accept a mission from the creator of the worlds and to establish between them the relationship of a sender, caller, and a messenger. So it is what does it mean for us to be created in the image of God? Means that we are each, because we're in the image of God, we are each God's messengers in the world. And we each have an assignment, right? And our assignment is to be God's messenger in the world. And you could be God's messenger in the world by doing good, right? You could be God's messenger in the world by mounting an army when you need to mount an army. You can be God's messenger in the world by acting righteously, right? Like we all cringe when Jews are, are criminals that end up in the newspaper. We tend to think of it, I think of like, defaming the Jewish people.
Right.
They're going to think worse of the Jewish people. But I think what Soloveitchik would say is when you act like that, you diminish God and you diminish God's image in the world because people will think less of God. Right. I'm not sure that's so true, right? I'm not sure that's so true. But, if these are the chosen people and this is how they're acting, then you diminish God but he continues in the piece, you have free will. God's not going to make you take up your job as messenger. It's your choice. You have free will. You can, do your job in the world to present to make God's image better in the world, or you cannot. and either, diminish the, the image of the Jewish people, diminish the image of God in the world, your choice.
Is that sort of like what Elise said?
I'm
That she
sorry.
told- Is that sort of
Right.
like what Elise had said?
I think so. I think it is what Elise said, right? Like, first of all, you have to believe that there's a God that wants
Right.
you to be a
But
messenger.
then the actions are your,
Right,
your
the
act-
actions are yours. Many people would reject the idea that there is a God in the world expecting us to be God's messenger, right? Like, you'd have to believe, Soloveitchik, and there's a piece in a moment, if we have time, we'll look at by Hartman. These are two Orthodox rabbis who both act with the 100% assumption that there is God. Now, obviously, not everybody accepts that or believes that. So if you, or you think it's my best hunch, right? It's my best hunch, but depends what day you ask me. There's obviously such a wide range of belief. There's, within Orthodoxy, there's a smaller range to choose from. So for Soloveitchik, in a way, I would say, once you believe that there's God in the world, even though you may not understand this God or why God lets these things happen or why good people suffer, and there are, questions that you might need to answer or say, I don't know the answer to them. But you have a task, right? But your task is to make the world a better place. So, while you're not thinking about those questions, or even while you are, you've got work to do. It breaks down, of course, if you don't believe that you're God's messenger in the world, or that you have even the ability to make the world a better place. Let's look quickly at one more thing. This is a little hard. I really like when we do like straight rabbinic texts, because I feel like it's hard. This is philosophy. So this is hard to read out loud to each other and to try to understand it. So this is David Hartman. He was a Jewish philosopher, rabbi, Jewish philosopher, founded the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, was an Orthodox rabbi, but probably amongst one of the most liberal Orthodox rabbis that one would have met. And one of his philosophy books is The God Who Hates Lies. And that includes what we say about God, right? God doesn't want us to be dishonest in how we express our faith. So if you have questions, ask questions. If you have doubts, say doubts. God doesn't want us to be, to only say nice things if that's not what we believe. But anyways, this is in the so this is from this book. Readers and critics have often pointed out that imbuing history with religious significance seems at odds with my theological insistence that we can have no access to God's will or plan for history. Okay. So what he's saying here is his philosophy and his theology is that we don't know, we never will know, we never can know what God's plans for history, meaning we can't read it into the past or certainly anticipate what it could be for the future. So why the Holocaust? Why the state of Israel? What we don't know. And we can't and shouldn't go about attributing these things to a divine plan. However, at the same time, Hartman writes about, and his critics pick up on, the idea of imbuing religious significance into history. So he asked the question, how can I religiously celebrate the establishment of the state of Israel when I lack a coherent way of understanding the Holocaust? So this is like a super important question.
Mhm.
You may or may not know, right? Well, Yom HaAtzmaut always falls on a weekday because it's designed to fall on a weekday. So you probably wouldn't know this because you probably aren't at a daily minyan on Yom HaAtzmaut. But when Israel was established, liberal Jew, the state of Israel, and that means modern Orthodoxy and liberal Jews, not the Haredi, not the ultra Orthodox, added liturgy to the Siddur. So on Yom Ha'atzmaut, one recites Hallel. Hallel are the psalms of rejoicing that we say on the holidays, on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So a religious decision was made to recite these prayers on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Because when Israel was founded in 1948, it felt like a miracle. It felt like it had religious significance. It felt like, so he's like, well, how can I say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut and celebrate it as a religious holiday? Then what the hell do I do about the Holocaust?
Right.
Right? What do I do about, now, Yom HaShoah is a fast day, right? Israel declared it a fast day. So there is a ritual way of observing Yom HaShoah. But as a theology, right? It's like, I'm supposed to have a coherent theology. And my coherent theology says we can't read God into history. And so I can't tell you why the Holocaust happened in relationship to God, because I have no theology that will cover it. And yet I understand, and my critics call me, a hypocrite, because on Yom HaAtzmaut, I recite Hallel. So this is a conundrum. How can I sing prayers of praise and thanksgiving for the rebirth of sovereign Jewish peoplehood on Yom HaAtzmaut, yet become silent and dumbfounded the moment I begin to contemplate that people's near annihilation? But he's got an answer for how he resolves this, right? How he resolves this. And he's quoting Soloveitchik, who we just read about being God's messengers, in a piece called Dodido Fek. The voice of my beloved calls is the name of an essay where he talks about God calling him. Between the metaphysics or logic of description and the metaphysics of logic of response, I have no way to make sense logically or rationally of a God who remains indifferent to evil perpetrated on such an overwhelming scale. Right? I can't make sense of this. Not theologically, not logically, not rationally, not philosophically. I can't come to terms with a God that would allow the Holocaust to happen. It destroys all rational coherence when one attempts to imagine a God passively supervising the events of the Holocaust, right? A God who knows what's happening in the world and has power to act and stands by and watches the Holocaust. He says, I cannot rationalize this or justify this. There is no metaphysics that can grasp this howling absence. The logic of description withers and breaks down. Therefore, I must be perfectly clear that halachic response does not derive from and should not be equated with attempt to give a description of the account of God's actions in history. So any religious response I have, reciting Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, is not because I believe that God acted in history.
Okay.
When it comes to Israel, I do not base the imperative of halachic response upon intimations or predictions about which stage of spiritual history Israel's state building occupies. There's no predetermined master narrative of Jewish history. I have no access to the divine plan. This is getting long. I just want to skip ahead. Rather, it presents the soul who seeks intimacy with his or her God a wide range of opportunities to set that God before one constantly. So I can have a relationship with God. I can have an intimate relationship with God without having to justify, rationalize God's lack of acting in history. God just doesn't act in history, but I can still have a relationship with God. Historical developments, while not descriptive of a divine plan, should also not be considered immune to this type of spiritual opportunity. An event took place that marked an amazing change in the Jewish condition of history. The religious significance of this event is rooted not in a metaphysical truth claim about its place in God's unfolding historical scheme, but in an existential mood. How do I, along with my community, express our joy and gratitude for this remarkable change in our fortunes? When I sing grateful prayers, it's not with the intention of thanking God for intervening in history to bring about a Jewish state, but because this momentous event awakens in me an existential response, and the tradition provides me with a spiritual language in which to express it. Right? Not because I believe God did this, God acted, God did anything, but when I experienced the founding of the state of Israel, I am so grateful for this change in Jewish history, and the language in which I, as a Jew, as a religious Jew, express that gratitude is through Hallel, through Psalms of gratitude, because I'm grateful. And I want to acknowledge that gratitude as a spiritual person. And I want to celebrate this as a spiritual person, but not because I think that God held up Moses's arms and now we have a modern state of Israel. You know, other people, maybe a secular poet would say, I can express this with a new poem or with a song, or there are other ways of doing it. Marcia?
So this is not saying Hallel. Well, the founding of the state of Israel is not about God, it's about Israel. It's about man acting.
Right, he doesn't say that specifically, and I'm
No.
surprised he doesn't say that specifically, but the fact that they're sharing this piece in a unit about human action, then the founding of the state of Israel, I mean, the founding of the state of Israel to me is the closest thing that spiritually I would experience as a miracle,
Mhm.
but human beings did it, right? Soldiers, people that died, people that, so, you know, the fact that he's focusing on, you know, but then if you feel that way, how do you, you know, if you feel that it's from God, how do you possibly explain the Holocaust, right? How do you, so to be able to say these horrible things happen in the world, which also come from human beings, and great things, things that feel like miracles, things that feel divine. Like, you know, I started this whole session by saying, I, am so worried and so disappointed in this government of Israel and what they're already doing to undermine democracy in Israel. And by the way, February 14th, we will have a very good speaker that will explain this in case you don't really, you know, you read about judicial reform, but what does it actually mean and what would it actually do? We're going to have a speaker whose expertise is at the Israeli Supreme Court explain it to us. I had dinner on Friday night. We're part of a Chavurah, not within the synagogue, with friends, though many of those people are now members of the synagogue. They weren't when we first started, but I've recruited them over the years. In any case, one of the gentlemen there who said, well, you know, judicial reform in Israel is really going to align, you know, the Israeli Supreme Court. It's a very left-wing Supreme Court, and it's not really in sync with the rest of Israel. And so really they're just looking to align the Supreme Court to be more representative of, you know, of the people. And it's like, yeah, I know that's what Netanyahu is saying, but now you realize not one legal scholar is saying that.
Yeah.
And you realize that once the Knesset can overrule the Supreme Court, he says to me, then there's really only two houses of government. And I'm like, there's no executive branch. There's only one. Anyways, and then the second story I shared is that Israel through Syria through Russia has requested aid from Israel, and Israel sending humanitarian aid to
Yeah.
Syria
Yeah.
under Operation Good Neighbor.
Right.
Right, and both of these things are true. Right, both of these things are true at the same time. As probably a million other examples in history. So. Anyways, anybody else have anything they want to add? Yes, Ina.
Not having the biblical or whatever sense to explain, but this is just to put in simple terms. what you just spoken about, what Hartman says, that he believed in God as a miracle for the state of Israel.
No, I don't think
Correct?
he did say that. He does not believe in God as a miracle for the state of Israel because he doesn't believe that God acts in history. But that
That's-
doesn't stop him from feeling like it's a miracle and
Right.
expressing it in religious language.
Right, so, but in the fact that he doesn't believe God is in history, so therefore, it's okay to doubt that God had anything to do with the Holocaust or whatever.
But he said the
I mean,
thought
we
of
can,
God-
we can feel, I don't want to say comfortable, but we can identify with the fact that we don't understand, where was God?
Theolog-
And when
theologically,
everybody says that,
right, theologically, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
yeah,
Right, you can't say that God acted in history and established the state of Israel, but God sat passively by. I mean, you could. I don't know why that would be satisfying, right? So, Harman saying you can't have it both ways. Once you say that God had no part in the Holocaust, then you have to say God had no part in the state of Israel, even if you feel that it's a miracle and you express it liturgically as a miracle. But you can't. If you want a coherent theology, maybe not
Mhm.
everybody cares about having a coherent theology, but if you wanted, like, I remember my professor, Neil Gilman, Alav HaShalom, wrote this book called Sacred Fragments, which there are some people from the congregation that are studying it right now. And when the book came out, he went on speaking tours all over the United States, spoke at conservative synagogues. And so his thing was, one must have a coherent theology. And he taught rabbinical students. And he's like, if you believe that the Torah is from God, then logically you have to believe that you have to follow the mitzvot, right? If you believe the Torah is from God, you have to follow the mitzvot. And then he went around and met a lot of American Jews at a lot of conservative synagogues who had no problem believing that the Torah was from God and that it had no bearing on their behavior. So, what people should believe and what people do isn't, not everybody has a coherent theology. But if you're a professor like Neil Gilman or you're a professor like David Hartman, then you must have a coherent theology. So that's what he says. You can't have both. Yeah, Marcia?
I remember one of the Hartman lectures that you shared with us years ago explained what I had grown up with in my Reformed Jewish congregation, which was this lack of spirituality in the movement and in the congregation and among grown-ups that I knew. And it was that many Jews had an argument with God that how they could not let go of God does things, that the things come from God, and this is a God who could allow the Holocaust to happen. They just couldn't do it, so they broke off a spiritual connection with God. And it's only been the next generation that has sought that and managed to, in some degree or ways, achieve it. And it really explained something I'd never exactly understood, and why it had never satisfied me, that there was something missing. And in the
Rabbi Frankel, right? I'm going to talk about God. You remember him from last year.
right.
Yeah.
But finding it in the conservative movement in my generation was what I had been missing with the previous generation.
I think it was like, I'm breaking up with you. Like the Jewish people were like, what can we even say about God in the decades after the Holocaust? Like, what is there to even say? And the anger, right? The anger, all of it. Like, what could you,
I'll be a cultural Jew. I'll
Right.
seek the organization.
Part of my community.
I want the community, but forget the
interesting
spiritual
thing now is that you have this subset, like, so bringing spirituality and singing and music and connecting in this very deep way. And then all of a sudden you have this group of young people that are like, we don't need Israel.
right.
Right, we're going to be, spiritual, and we believe in God, and we're going to go to synagogue, and we're going to like follow the mitzvot. But Israel, we don't need Israel. So, and Israel was one of the really the pillars for two generations of Jews that were like, I don't know what I don't know what I'm going to think about God, but I'm going to throw all my passion into Israel. So, it's always evolving. It's very interesting. Eileen?
I think there's always been a certain amount of cognitive dissonance in being Jewish.
Mm.
It's like you try to reconcile A with B, but forget about it.
Look, we could look at the Holocaust, but the 2,000 years of history before the Holocaust was no walk in the park. I mean, it was awful. I mean, because I spoke with this on the High Holidays, but having been in Italy last summer and having been in Rome, and it was like just reminded of, 1,700 years of vicious, murderous, church-led anti-Semitism. It's been quite the history. And in any case, I know, Marcia, you're leaving for warmer, sunnier climes, but I hope that I will see you all checking in, both in person and if not in person, by live stream, to meet Dara and to
Oh, yes.
see what we all think.